Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. We're super excited this week to share our interview with evolutionary biologist and the author of Slow Birding, Joan Strassmann. Joan has a new book coming out. It's actually being released this week on October 22nd and is called the Slow Birding Journal. Described as a unique companion for bird enthusiasts seeking a deeper connection with the avian world around them, the journal encourages a slow, mindful approach to birding, celebrating the beauty and diversity of birds wherever you find them. We talked to Joan all about her new book and get an interesting backstory on her first book as well. Okay, time to grab your binoculars or maybe your reading glasses, and let's get into it. All right, well, welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This is RJ, and I'm with John, Shannon, and Amanda, and we're really excited to have Joan Strassmann joining us, author of Slow Birding and soon to be coming out Slow Birding Journal. So thank you so much, Joan, for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be with you on this sunny day.
So we're all very familiar with slow birding, but for some of our listeners who aren't familiar, do you want to kind of give us an overview of slow birding?
Yeah, so I guess the minute the slow food movement came out, I immediately thought, oh, we should have slow birding. We don't need to be running around the world finding birds. We can just watch the ones that are right close at home. And if we pay attention to all the research the ornithologists have done, we can really learn something without really going anywhere. So when I wrote the book, I really made it a point to write about the very most common birds.
That's awesome. We've read different parts of your book before, and we each week cover like a different bird, and there's lots of times where we cover birds from all over the world, exotic birds, and we always come back to like a slow birding bird as well. Amanda always brings it up. We should do one. So looking at like your list, we've done blue jay, house wren, northern flicker, European starling, northern cardinal. And so, I mean, we're definitely practice the slow birding as well.
Oh, that's great. Well, my next book will be about birds from all over the world because I think they are also worth looking at, just not running around chasing.
Well, that's one of the things we try to do is encourage Amanda and RJ to travel as much as they can down the road.
Yeah.
It starts in our backyard and then we can go from there.
I did not grow up watching birds. So the chasing all over the world thing didn't fit in with my personal experiences. I never went anywhere. I didn't go in a plane until I was pretty old. And all my experiences were with camping. Or I grew up in the mountains of British Columbia, so I would just go outside. I didn't have to go exotic places to see wildlife. It was everywhere.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty special thing to grow up in that area. It's so beautiful and so many great birds. And I bird elsewhere mostly because when I was little, my parents brought me to places. My dad was a professor and had sabbaticals. Now I'm a professor and I go places. So, yeah.
So when I actually listened to your book, and every once in a while I do that because I can listen in more places than I can read. And I was transported back to being a kid, but also to the beginning of the pandemic when I spent an inordinate amount of time in our yard looking at birds, where things like house sparrows became my constant friends, to where you could identify individuals after a while that you would see and then mourn to the loss of some of the more unique plumaged ones. And so I really like that concept of paying attention to things that are in your house, at your house, around you.
Yeah, I totally agree. We have a flock of common grackles that comes to our feeders every day, and our desks both look out on them. And there's one of them that has one leucistic white feather, and so I can always know that one starling. The others are not so easy to tell apart.
Right now, the grackles are molting, so to me, they look like monsters. You know, they take on these horrific kinds of plumages at this time of year, and I don't know why I find them so creepy.
Halloween.
I love the grackles.
I've decided Morning doves whine. These guys have heard me say that a million times, that morning doves are whiners, but,
And Joan, I wanted to know, so our friend and one of our favorite listeners, Diane Seekman, she gave us your book last year. And I was wondering, the timing of your book, did it come out during COVID?
Yes, and I think that it was the enforced lack of travel during COVID that bought me the time to write it. I'd been talking about writing it for about 15 years, and I even had a agent 10 years before it came out. And I just decided I better do it because I can't just keep talking about doing it. So, it's kind of amazing to me I actually finished it.
I was just say, your book was like for people who were sequestered at home. I feel like it's such a great message for people like in the future when we're not able to travel or leave our homes as much, to be able to, really take advantage of whatever we can from our vantage point.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of really amazing stuff about our very commonest birds. I mean, from, robin fathers caring more for blue eggs to, house sparrows really only live in the cities and towns, so we don't really have to worry about them as much as we do about starlings. Yeah, there's just so much out there that's known about these birds. Yeah, that makes it more fun if you understand them.
So you've been thinking about your book for a long time before you published it. What was the impetus, like in the way back time? How much of a role did the teaching that you do play in how this book came to be?
So the book totally comes from teaching, and I know most academics write books based on their research. My research is, the first half of my career was on wasps, and they sting, and I love them, but some don't. And then I started working on a social amoeba, and, I could write books on those, but what I wanted was to be able to write something where people could go outside and have what I have written enrich their experiences. And that's totally comes from my undergrads and how I taught in kind of a simple way, where I would just take them outside and show them a few species of birds and say, okay, you watch them and you figure out a question to answer. So the book completely comes from that experience.
And can you talk a little bit about the journal? Because I'm guessing that's kind of taking it to the next step of how do you start writing stuff down?
Yeah, so I'm really excited about the journal. It's coming out on October 22nd. I think Barnes & Noble keeps running specials on it, so you might want to look and see if you can get it for cheap. The point of the journal is to take both the 16 birds that I wrote about, but then also just some free-form prompts. And the pages, each prompt has a side and a half of those dots, so you can either draw or write rather than lines or completely blank. So we had a lot of discussion about the exact size of the dots. I'm hoping they came out well. And it'll just allow people to start getting outside and actually drawing and writing something about the birds. And, Amy Tan just came out with a lovely book where she sort of published her journal. And so maybe mine can get people started on their own experiences with taking notes.
John and I just introduced her and had a panel with her in Evanston, Illinois. Was it in June? Beginning of June. And so I loved reading her book. And often for the same reasons I like listening to yours, because it just, they take you places. And then the other thing that I found fascinating about her book too, which is that you get invested with the people, not just the birds she talks about, but with the people that she's interacting with, and how the social nature of this is it may be a little different than the way people often think of birding, which is a sole thing that boys or men do, but we're little old ladies, nobody in between.
Yeah, that's true. I introduced her. I had a conversation with her for the St. Louis Public Library just before she went to you. And then we saw her again when she came up here to Traverse City. So that was a lot of fun. I made sure to read all her books because she had made comments about illiterate conversants, and I was not going to be one.
Ooh, that's a lot of
So,
pressure.
well, we really hit it off. We went out to dinner afterwards. It was a lot of fun. So yeah, I mean, she encourages people to not be afraid of drawing and to find their ability to draw. And she mentions these courses, free online courses. I think, was it Muir?
John, yeah.
John Muir. Anyway, yeah, maybe for a start, they can use my journal and get some prompts for what to do. I like to draw sometimes. My daughter was doing field research in Colorado, and sometimes they would go on to a part of the trail where the cliffs were just a bit much for me. And I would just stop and take out my little notebook and draw, wait for the kids to come back. They always did, fortunately. And of course, they're not kids anymore. They're, grown-ups.
Did you draw growing up?
I did. My father was German, and drawing was just a part of what we did. And we also painted. So when we came up here to northern Michigan with my dad and my grandfather, I mean, one of the things we'd do is we would go look for a blick or a view and get out the paints and the easels and all of that, and we'd all paint something. And none of us were very good at it, but it was sort of a great experience.
What was the first bird that you drew?
I didn't really draw birds. I drew landscapes, and then we also had sort of a family tradition of Christmas gifts, which would be cartoons of anecdotes that had happened to the family. So then we'd have to draw people. I mean, I've drawn blue jays and robins and house sparrows and some simple birds since, but now that this next book on social lives of birds is almost done, I'm going to be spending more time drawing.
So I want to focus on the issue of writing, because I mean, obviously you're a behavioral evolutionary biologist, and so writing becomes so important. And I think when I think about, part of it is I can't draw. And I like trying, but nobody's going to get much out of my drawing. But if I can think about how to record stuff and get better at it, that was one thing during the pandemic. And I was sitting on our front porch in the morning, and I was watching these chimney swifts come down and into this elm tree. And I finally realized what they were doing was actually breaking off sticks for their nests. And, just like the idea of sitting there and thinking about, how would I describe that if I had to, was something that I really like about what you're doing with slow birding.
Yeah, I mean, writing is hard, and my professional writing is almost an impediment to writing for a general audience that, I'm constantly fighting. I listen to lots of online courses and read books on writing, and I can't say I've got it all figured out, but I do enjoy it. And it's just all about revising, and I've got a whole spreadsheet of who's read what, and I get the scientists to read the parts for accuracy, and then I have various editors that read it, and my husband puts all the commas in, and also he will tell me not just how to fix what's there, but what's not there and should be. So yeah, it's hard, but yeah, it's fun. Actually, I got into writing more popularly when I started a blog. I left Houston after 30 years, so I started a blog, Goodbye Houston, and that really gave me the sense for how to write for a broader audience. Because with the blog, this was, 15 years ago, you get immediate feedback. And then I wrote one on sort of advice for students and advice for scientists and, how to write a letter of recommendation and those sorts of things. And that, again, just helped me learn how to write for a more public audience.
So doing this podcast does a lot of the things that writing did for you. But I have this fear of writing a book. I don't know why. Talking to people is easier for me to conceive of than talking in through my words on paper.
Was it Anne Lamott who said bird by bird for writing? All a book is a whole series of paragraphs. Yeah, the thing about slow birding was I didn't have to have this huge narrative arc from the beginning to the end because it was kind of 16 birds. So I could write a chapter about one bird and, read a huge amount of literature and then pick the 5 or 10 things that were really cool and write about that bird and then move on. But yeah, writing a book with a huge narrative arc and it's challenging, but everything worthwhile is challenging at the end of the day.
I never thought of it like that, the idea of kind of what we do here, which is pick a bird. And one of the things I love about doing this is that you serially get very invested in literature that maybe you haven't heard of before, all through that one species as the nexus of, and then you end up all over the place. If you're me, you end up all over the place once you start with that bird as a focus, and you get into all kinds of literature you never knew about. You learn about people you never knew about. For me, I also learned about the origins of words. I really like words. So that's kind of come up for me too as I do this, is that there's all these things that I didn't know I was interested in that all of a sudden I really am.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's just to me a much more rewarding thing to do than to read my Facebook scroll or even the newspaper. If I want to learn about a specific bird and I can immerse myself in that bird, it's really a calming influence to everything else that's going on.
So Joan, you mentioned after Slow Birding Journal comes out that you have another book that you're working on. How did you select the birds for that book?
So this book, it was a lot more challenging for me because it's not bird by bird.
Okay.
It's subject by subject. So its title, it'll be something like Social Lives of Birds. So the first chapter is about flocks and flocking birds, and I talk maybe about 10 species. And then I talk about roosts, and so there's tons of birds in that book.
Okay.
So it was a lot more challenging for me to write. And it's also birds from all over the world, many of which I've seen. I'm going on my first bird trip this February. I've never been on one before.
Oh.
It's with the St. Louis Audubon to Belize. I've
Oh.
never done that before. I've just birded casually wherever my research or family trips took us. So
Oh, how exciting.
That's
Where are you going?
Belize, I'm not sure where there. But I'm afraid it won't be slow birding. But I'm thinking of writing something at some point about how to do slow birding and still travel. Spend longer at each place and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting thing. And one recommendation I would have on that, based on a little bit of talking to people, is maybe going on the photography trips that are offered. Because the photographers tend to be a lot more willing to stay in place and watch things. We have a colleague of ours who's a volunteer at the museum who's a very, very good photographer, and she's been on a number of trips to places like Florida. She might have even been to Belize on a trip specifically designed to take photos, which of course has its own problems because those folks want specific things when they go out too.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily gonna just go on trips. I can just go to go to a place on my own. I spent time as a little kid in Mexico, went to Mexican schools, so I've got Spanish. So, yeah, of
Well,
course, you don't need it in Belize.
I'll be interesting to see what happens because my dad, who is the person that got me into birding, was an organic chemistry professor. And he got to the point where he was looking around to try to figure out what he was going to do. And my brother and I, who are both birders, said, why don't you take a birding trip? And by the time my dad died, he'd seen 8,000 birds around the world. And there was almost no place he hadn't been, which was just kind of crazy how it can, with certain people, become just
Right,
an incredible passion.
right. Well, I'm from St. Louis, where Phoebe Snetzinger was from, and she certainly saw a lot of birds. I have friends that want to see one of each family and that sort of stuff. And I have read bird adventure books where you read the whole book. It's a great read, but at the end of it you realize you have not learned a single thing about a single bird. So I just want to tell the stories of the birds. There's just so many great stories.
No, and it's stories and science. I mean, that's the thing. I absolutely appreciate the science you bring into it every time.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, by stories, I guess I mean the science, what the birds do, why they do it, how we know what they do, all of those sorts of things are just, yeah. And the Slow Birding Journal will not have references, but uh, Slow Birding certainly, every fact that I mentioned had a tiny little footnote at the back. Publishers weren't super happy about that, and I just said that it would be a deal breaker for me to not have references for the things I put in there.
Tell me a little bit about the artist that you have in your slow birding book, because I found that
Oh,
process. Yeah, I
Anthony?
found that process really interesting, and I think he must be really interesting.
He's great. So he's actually lives in Chicago now,
Oh,
and you should look for him. His website is fadingroyalty.com. He's really quite a fantastic artist, but he does very kind of mural or cartoon-like art. And I was determined to get an artist for whom this would make a difference. I didn't want to just get the same person everyone else got. So he's a young African American guy. And I wasn't going to ask him to draw birds because it almost seems like it would have been insulting given all this fabulous other art he does. But then I realized he was asked, so he was in my lab. So he's a biology art double major. So I knew him. But he asked me for a letter of recommendation. And I realized he was looking at scientific drawing. And then he had an interview at the OB-GYN department at WashU. So I thought, well, if he's going to draw for them, certainly he might want to draw a few birds. And so, yeah, he just did a great job. He's the artist for the next book also.
I mean, I love spending time with people like that because they always take you different places. If I spend time just with people like me, I don't travel nearly as many corners of the earth as I do when I spend time, especially with young people who
Right.
can make me optimistic for the world.
It's a joy of being a professor, all the young minds that you can influence and learn from.
Yeah. Yeah, I've learned that I like networks, not hierarchies, and that comes directly from spending so much time with with high school students, for example.
Well, Joan, so I know you mentioned this comes out in October. So you mentioned Barnes and Noble, but where else can we find the Slow Birding Journal for people that want to go out and get a copy?
I'm guessing you can just find it wherever books are sold. You
Okay.
can certainly get it from Penguin. You can get it from your local indie book dealer by order, if they don't have it on their shelves. But yeah.
Okay, great.
I don't think it'll be hard to get.
So, do people interact with you differently since publishing a book on birds? I mean, certainly scientifically, you're known for a completely different genre of science, even though some of the tools you use are the same. And so I was wondering kind of how people approach you and what the weirdest question you've been asked is.
I mean, I've given lots of talks. I've given a couple up here in northern Michigan at the Leland Library and the Northport Library and the Wild Birds in Traverse City. People think I know more about birds than I do, so they'll ask me really specific questions about birds that I can't answer. Yeah, people are surprised just in this little neighborhood when they figure out that I wrote this book. They're surprised. But I don't know. I go to the American Ornithological Society meetings, and that's a lot of fun, and almost no one knows who I am. So I can just do what I like. I wouldn't really say people have approached me particularly differently.
It's fun to interact with different people, I imagine.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah.
Well, Joan, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so we just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on and joining us, and we're really excited for the Slow Birding Journal. Yeah, if there's anything else you wanted to talk about before we close it out on this one, or anything else you want to plug?
Oh, I just hope people can find the time to get outside and maybe take a youngster along with them. Here we've got a 7-year-old who's getting very into birds, and it's a really fun thing to do. It connects you with nature kind of like nothing else can. And I always like to remember that birds are there because they want to be, because they can always fly away.
Oh, I love that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. Well, have a good rest of your weekend.
Yeah,
You too.
You as
Thanks
well,
so
too.
much, Joan.
Enjoy the fall weather.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for joining us this week. We appreciate all of you. If you have a question for us, you can reach us at podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. All right, we love you all. See everyone next week.